Hey everybody, today we're going to discuss a little bit about my journey through sliders, and we'll talk about each of the three sliders that I have purchased and how they solved the problems at hand at the time I needed them. First one, of course, is my original igus slider. This one I had to, this is before they even had a camera department, so I had to buy all the parts separately, figure out which size of slider I needed, what kind of carriage to have, and then I had to kind of modify everything in order to make it work with what I wanted to. It was great. Everything worked really well. It still is a really smooth thing after all these years. Had it for, I think, 5-6 years. The idea here is that the reason why I like it so much is because when I do documentaries, I like to do interviews, and in those interviews I like to have two cameras. Camera A, camera B. Camera A is stationary, always looking at the interviewee. Camera B also is always looking at the interviewee, but it's moving along the track and auto kind of panning to keep the subject in frame. It takes a lot of practice to do that manually to make it so that it's nice and smooth, but it also means that I have to have a second cameraman there with me every time I do that. And it worked. I needed to do it, but it was always hard to get all three of our schedules together, the interviewee, my schedule, and the cameraman's schedule all together. So I thought, well, there's got to be a better way. Maybe I wish I could just get a motorized one, because I saw people had the cranks. I saw motorized ones. I thought, well, let's just try to see if I can get a motorized one. So I discovered that Servo City created a igus slider motorized kit. I'll put this down. And but the problem is my original slider was purchased way before they even had such a thing as a motorized kit, and so it wasn't compatible with any of the kits that they developed. So I had to buy a new rails. So the kit itself was like 120 bucks. It came with the belt, the mounting hardware, but not the motor, ironically, because they wanted to give you that option of what speed do you want? What kind of motor do you want to use? A servo? Do you want to use, whatever. There's lots of different ones you could use. So the motor itself was separate. It was an additional, I think, 25 bucks. Then there's a controller for it, which it not only controls the speed but also what direction it's going. That one was about 70 bucks. And so as you can see, it works, and you can slow down the speed, make it go the other direction. Now, while this does create for smoother sliding, smoother tracking shots, there still has to be someone here controlling the controller. So it still doesn't help me out with not having to have a second cameraman there. So then I discovered that there were such things as auto panning devices called parallax devices. They bolt to an existing slider, and it has another rail with a bearing block that runs parallel to your slider. Great invention. I bought one, attached it, and then I was able to use this to go backwards and forwards, and it would continually keeping it in panning so that the subject was always in frame. Still, problem was there still had to be a physical person here changing the direction of the slider and how fast it was supposed to go. So then I discovered CheesyCam.com, which I already knew from a long time ago, but M came up with this very simple circuit with a relay block that allowed his slider to go back and forth automatically, switching directions every time it got to the ends, using the relay block with some micro switches. Answered. My problem was answered. So I built one of those, but I also wanted to be able to control the speed. His is a double throw, double pull, and I wanted to be able to do where I can control the speed. So I built this little box, and it has inside of it the relay block and the relay, along with the potentiometer to control the speed. So this works really well. Here's a little video on how I made that. Here's my potentiometer, and there's my relay block and all the wire set up. And as soon as the carriage hits the micro switch, it goes in the other direction. Now all I had to do was to get it to fit inside of a project box, so it looked more professional. As you might imagine, there wasn't a lot of room once you get both the relay and the block and the potentiometer in there. So I drilled some holes for mounting it to my slider, as well as access for the wires to go through. Things got a lot tighter once I wired everything together in there, but I still got it to fit. This shows my initial test run after I mounted the controller onto the slider. Now, I hadn't yet attached the parallax device to the slider, so the far micro switch was not mounted at this point. I mounted my battery using Velcro to the underside of my slide rail. It was perfect. It only had 6 wires coming out in total, 2 for power, 2 for left switch, and 2 for right switch. Here's what it looked like with everything together: slider, motor, controller, micro switches, and the parallax device. So that was great for about 2 or 3 months, but then, like I said, things started going wrong with the parallax device. It required constant recalibration every few minutes of use. I had to keep on, no matter how I lubricated it, no matter how I adjusted it, oftentimes it would just bind. And I'm thinking, this is just not what I really wanted. And if you had to take it on location, it was a pain because it would take 15 minutes just to get it to working right. Well, when it stopped working altogether, I thought, rather than spending another $280 to replace it, let me see if there's anything else out there. So this is my latest slider. Now this one actually has a parallax device that's built in. It's internal. There's this rod that's situated in the center, and as you move it, it is attached to an offset bearing block that goes through the carriage here and turns whatever is attached to it. So as I move it, it'll pan. This is made by a company called Ashanks, and this is actually the cheapest version of this design. Andover makes a version, Neewer makes a version, and then on up. You have several different companies making sliders that are based on this same design. But in all of them, virtually all of them, in fact, I think all of them, the number one complaint you hear from people is about how loud they are. So for doing, and it comes with a controller, for doing time-lapse photography or for doing video. You can control the direction of the slider, and if you want to do time-lapse photography. So I read in those reviews how loud the motor was. I thought, well, and I looked at I knew that the RPM motor on it was very low RPM, so if you have that cranked up to go at a decent speed across your slider, it's going to make a lot of noise. So I thought, well, that's probably what they're talking about. So when I first got it, rather than, the first thing I did is I replaced the new motor that was on it, the lower RPM one, with the higher RPM one that I was using. I thought, okay, this is going to solve my problem. But then I hooked it up and I started it. If you can hear that noise, that's a whine that's not the motor. It's actually caused from the controller. So no matter how fast or how slow I have this thing, it's still just as noisy. And you can hear this thing all the way across the room. So for video work, this isn't going to work, at least not with the controller. So I thought, well, okay, I still like the idea of being able to do time-lapse photography with this, but I can't use this for video, so I'll just use the one that I already built for doing video. But I thought, well, I got to do a different thing, because the one before I had everything mounted on one end, and I just had the cables for the micro switches going to the length of the rail. Well, there's no way to really do that on this one. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to mount the micro switches to the thing, to the carriage, and have it bounce back and forth that way. So I discovered that there was this guy on YouTube who had modified his controller to do the same thing that this does, whereas it ping-pongs back and forth once it hits the micro switch. And evidently there's a relay inside that does that. But again, I didn't want to use this for video because of the way the motor makes that whine. So I'm going to use this. But in order to do that, I had to mount everything to the carriage and not to the ends. So I had to come up with kind of different design. And I'm going to talk about how I made that right now. So now that I was no longer going to be able to have the controller mounted in a stationary position to the end of the slider, I needed to rework how my cabling was to go. At first, I thought about just having those 6 wires in pairs lengthened so that they would all meet at the carriage permanently attached. But then I realized I didn't want the controller permanently tethered to the slider. I wanted it detachable. So I added these terminal ends to be able to have the controller, 3 long cables, which was 2 wires in each cable, leading up to the carriage and the switches and the motor. But I wasn't happy with my initial idea using these terminal ends. I wanted it simple. What I really wanted was a single cable, or even just 2, running from the controller to the carriage. The problem is that I have 6 wires that need to go to the end, 2 for power, 2 for the left switch, and 2 for the right switch. After toying with the idea of using a USB cabling which only has 4 internal wires, I went for Cat5 or Ethernet. It has 8 wires. I bought a couple of Ethernet extension cables that I cut and then used the ends as interfaces. I connected all the internal wiring in the controller to the Ethernet cable and tested it out on my old slider. It works great. So once I knew it would work with Ethernet, I finalized everything and soldered. I am not good at soldering, so I really hope that these things hold up. So on the slider end, I had to figure out how to mount 2 micro switches onto it, as well as a Ethernet plug receiver, and also figure out a way to make one motor work for both controllers. So obviously you can tell I used epoxy to secure these micro switches. I did a terrible job because it just oozes everywhere and I didn't do a very good job cleaning it up. But it works. They're very secure in there. There are 8 total wires coming out of this receiver, and 2 of them are for this switch, 2 of them are for this switch, and then 4 of them are for this power cable. Now for the motor, you can see there are 2 cables coming out of the motor, and that's by design. I wanted to still be able to use the original controller that came with the sliders to do time-lapse photography, but I didn't want to have to actually modify the cabling to have the same kind of interface as my other one. So what I did is I took it off of the original motor and I tied the 2 of these together, so both the positives were tied together, both the negatives were tied together. Then I soldered it onto the posts of the motor itself. So now I can choose. If I want to do video, I will use this one, and it plugs into the power one coming from the Ethernet. And if I want to do time-lapse photography, I use this one. And so it all works out really well. I'm really happy with how this works. In order for this to switch polarity at the ends of each of the things, I had to put stoppers. And these stoppers are made by taking a shelving bracket that you can buy at the hardware store, and I just basically epoxied it down, which of course you can see it's all messy. I took one of these rubber stoppers and I put it in on the ends, and it fits very snug there and it stays. So that's what I use as stoppers. So there it is. There's my journey into the sliders, and I really like that it can do all the 3 things that I really needed it to do. It can do parallax, it can automatically ping pong back and forth, and it's a very smooth slider. And bonus feature, it also does time-lapse photography. And as you can see from this wide shot, it's working just fine. It's as soon as it hits that micro switch, it'll go back to the next one. So there it goes. I'm very happy with it. I highly recommend this. If you can afford the higher end models, they're probably made out of a little bit of better materials, but I'm actually pretty happy with this. If you notice, it's a very smooth thing. I'm always in the frame, and it's not jerky, it's not doing any kind of weird vibration, it's smooth. And so that's what is one of the most important things to me. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.